The Fed is currently renovating two historic buildings here in Washington, D.C., and they've said those renovations are basically meant to consolidate all their operations in one place and really restore these two historic buildings that are very old and that the Fed says haven't been comprehensively restored in quite some time. And so that's kind of the Fed's rationale for these renovations. They were approved by the Fed's board several years ago. So this project is not a new project. The Trump administration scrutiny of it is new, but this project has been going on for quite a while. And so what we're seeing here is President Trump and those in his administration now taking issue with the overall price tag of the project, which has increased in recent years, and then also taking issue with what Fed Chair Jerome Powell said about some of the design features in the renovation when he was on the Hill last month talking about these renovations. And some of the administration officials are basically alleging that Powell was not truthful in that testimony, and that seems to be what they're using to kind of lay the groundwork to say that perhaps President Trump has cause to remove Chair Powell from his position on the Fed's Board of Governors, because of course to remove someone from the Fed's Board of Governors, you have to meet a very high legal standard, which is cause, something like malfeasance or neglect of duty. And so some administration officials seem to be trying to use this renovation issue to try and establish that cause.
Amara, as you mentioned, this is not new. This renovation has been going on for quite some time now, but is this the first time that the magnitude of the renovation is really being questioned?
Yeah, I would say so. And what kind of set this off was media reports about some of the features in the renovation. Basically, there was a media report that sort of characterized some of the features in the renovation as very lavish, very extravagant. And so that led to Republican senators, when Chair Powell was on the Hill last month, that led them to sort of question him over why there are some of these features, why the costs for the project have increased over the years. And so that is what kind of sort of brought this issue into the forefront recently, and then we've really seen the administration kind of seize upon it and use it as part of their overall sort of criticism of Chair Powell's stewardship of the Fed, both when they're talking about his interest rate, his stance on interest rates, and then also when they're talking about how he has managed this construction project.
What are observers of the Federal Reserve saying about this, and to what extent this could be? This is not part of the Fed's dual mandate by any means, right? Stable prices, maximum employment. The Fed chair has laser focused on that mandate that comes from Congress. He tells us that when we hear from him every few weeks. What are observers saying about this sort of, I'm not going to call it a sideshow because that's editorializing a little bit, but it's not core to the Fed's mission by any means, and it's very political.
It is very political, and I think what Fed observers are saying is that this is just a part of this pressure campaign that President Trump and many in his administration are putting on Chair Powell and Fed policymakers to lower interest rates. Fed observers don't see these things as separate issues. They see it as part of the same pressure campaign. And it also really matters because, of course, we know that Chair Powell's term is up next year, next May, and President Trump's search for the next Fed chair is also on. And so it really does raise questions about what that search will look like and who President Trump will ultimately pick. Is he going to pick someone who is going to be more receptive to his views and the pressure that he puts on them when it comes to monetary policy and some of these other issues about the institutional management of the Fed? And so I think even beyond Chair Powell, it really does raise these questions about what the Fed looks like when the next chair takes over.
Mm-hmm. Amara, in regards to this renovation, what can really be done at this point? I mean, the builders are building. This has been going on for some time. Does the president then have the authority to come in and just cancel the entire thing, scale it back? How does that look?
I mean, I think the Fed has said that a lot of different input went into getting approved for this project, including the National Capital Planning Commission. There are a lot of different bodies that sort of weighed in on this project, and I don't think it's within the president's purview to sort of stop the project. In the law, the Fed has authority over its own buildings because the Fed, in so many ways, is an independent agency. But I think what the administration and what President Trump are really trying to do, they're trying to sort of question the optics around this, right? Bill Pulte, one of the administration officials who has really focused in on this renovation, will say things like, Jerome Powell is keeping interest rates high and making affordability difficult for Americans while he builds himself a $2.5 billion palace, right? Essentially, I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially like some of the lines of criticism. And so what you really see administration officials doing is really calling into question the credibility of Chair Powell. And again, you can't separate those efforts from the efforts that the administration is putting forward to try and make the Fed follow their lead on interest rates.
Amara, what happens to the Federal Reserve if Fed Chair Powell is forced out in some way? There's a Deutsche Bank analyst who essentially says that we could see a drop of at least 3 to 4% in the trade-weighted dollar. This is George Saravelos of Deutsche Bank. There would be 30 to 40 basis point sell-off in fixed income. He essentially argues that all this is underpriced.
Yeah, I mean, I think any economist you talk to, any investor who you talk to will say, look, if Fed Chair Jerome Powell is pushed out, or if there's any sort of inkling that the Fed is bowing to President Trump's pressure and any questions start to arise about whether the Fed is continuing its independence, like that is not good for the economy, one, and then that is not good for sort of the Buy America trade, right? We could see pressure on the dollar, we could see pressure on treasuries. And so, to be clear, President Trump has continued to say that he's not going to fire Chair Powell, but I think these sorts of questions, again, sort of raise the stakes when it comes to what's going to happen with Chair Powell's replacement, because any feeling that the Fed's independence is being compromised or that we have a person who's more likely to listen to Trump could be bad for sort of the Buy America trade.